Amanda Kahl has been working on her webcomic fantasy epic for over 10 years now. Join us as we talk with Amanda as she tells us about the work that goes into creating a long-form fantasy saga in the webcomic medium using the old-fashioned method of doing everything by hand. Layouts, drawing, inking, and lettering. You're going to be amazed. So everybody, welcome. This is episode 6 of Storycomic Presents, and I have with me in the studio the writer, artist, creator. To begin with, first, kind of give us an overview of what Age of Night is, and then we'll dive into your background.
Sure. So Age of Night is a epic quest fantasy. It's sort of in a swords and sorcery type vein where you don't really have anything like demi-humans or too much in the way of big mythic beasts or anything. It's really just there's magic and it's set in a pseudo-medieval type setting, and it's about a group of friends that are on this quest to free one of them from a reincarnation cycle that makes him a slave to the church in their world and has turned him into a house cat. And along the way, you have ninjas and mages, and he learns how to turn into a giant cat monster and just all sorts of adventures.
So tell us about, because I have, as you imagine, lots of questions.
I'm sure.
But how did you get into it? What was...
So I always liked to draw, basically from whenever I could hold a crayon, as young as however young that is, that kids start drawing, like 2 or something. And I also always liked stories, and I liked telling stories. And so I always just naturally did it together. Just even as a kid, like I was just like, I'm going to draw my own story and I'm going to write the story underneath it. And it wasn't even until I was much older that I realized that that was a thing. Like that, oh, this is a medium that exists. Like this is a thing that people do. They put words and images together, and it's a whole artistic medium. And so it was just one of those things. I always did it on my own free time, just for myself. And it wasn't until I was in like high school and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And I'm like, oh, I don't know. I really like doing comics, and I still make them all the time for my own amusement and the amusement of my friends. But I don't know if that's really what I want to do for a career. And then I spent a summer as an intern at an insurance company. And I said, nope, I'm going to art school. No way I'm doing that for a living. So yeah, and then I went off and went to the Savannah College of Art and Design and got my degree in sequential art.
So what is sequential art? And in comparison to somebody that does cartooning, where there's different words, it's interesting to me to hear the term sequential art. How does that compare to somebody that gets a degree in working in comic books or whatnot?
It's the same thing. So SCAD, the Savannah College of Art and Design, was one of the first, I think it was the first college in the country to offer a 4-year degree for comics. And part of the thing was, though, that I'm friends with one of the professors that helped found the major, and they were basically like, hey, so we have to try to sell this as something that sounds academic to the president of the college, or she won't let us have a major. We have to make it sound better than comics. Oh, we'll use that fancy term that Will Eisner used. We'll call it sequential art, so that Paula Wallace will let us make a major of it. But yeah, it's the same. It's just comics. That's just the official title on the degree is sequential art. And we did study some other stuff too that's not strictly speaking comics. We did have to learn about storyboarding. We did have to learn about some animation techniques. But primarily it's just comics. It's the same thing. It's just a fancy academic term for comics.
So you bring up a good point. There is, some of our mutual friends do storyboarding as that. That would be considered sequential art in a way as well.
Yep.
What other types of, other than doing comics or storyboarding, what other types of career opportunities would people get if they got a degree in sequential art?
A lot of people kind of branch out from there into illustration, especially children's book illustration, because children's book illustration really has a lot more in common with comics and the storytelling techniques that you have to use than you do in like traditional like advertising type illustration or political cartooning or that sort of thing. Because you're still mostly trying to convey the story visually and get all of the like actions across in a visual way. So that's where you see a lot of crossover. I mean, people also get work doing things like making like instructional cartoons, like the actual like images, instructional illustrations that go along with like a set of directions for stuff. That's also a form of sequential art because you have to be really particular about how you do stuff like that. But the biggest ones are really still going to be in like storyboarding and animation and just getting work in comics. So.
What were some of the, I mean, obviously getting a 4-year degree in something, you're going to have literally hundreds and thousands of hours of doing some things.
So many hours.
Yeah. And I always recall a trainer that I had once, or professor I had at one time, who said, no matter how much you do this, you're still going to only recall 20% of what you heard. What would be some of those things when you sit down and you do, when you teach kids or you do something about, you know, teaching somebody how to do something along those lines of sequential art, what are some of the takeaways that you really want to make sure that the people you talk to kind of teach about how to do this, what are a couple of those techniques or something that you want to really make sure they remember that you tell them or teach them?
So, the biggest thing is always clarity. And that's something that can be really difficult to get across because it's difficult to develop the eye for clarity because you know what you want the image to say. Like, you know what the context of what you're drawing is, but you have to learn how to step back and look at it and realize, but would somebody else look at this and understand what they're seeing? So that is probably like the biggest takeaway and the biggest thing that going through a program like that, where you're constantly being critiqued and constantly looking at other people's work that's maybe not that great yet. Like yours is also not that great yet because you're still learning. And realizing that, yeah, you have to realizing how to make things as clear as possible. Because it's like some stuff may look really cool, but it doesn't necessarily convey the action that you're supposed to be conveying or the mood that you're trying to convey or whatever else, something really subtle sometimes. So that's the biggest thing, is like trying to get visual clarity across. Because I still read comics all the time, even published comics, that I'm like, what just happened? Like, and then you like flip the page back and forth a couple times and you read back over it and you're like, wait, did what? Like, there's a breakdown of visual storytelling here because I don't know what happened.
That's a really, I've never heard, that's amazing, because when you bring that up, it's something that makes sense, but nobody really teaches you about that.
Yeah.
Wow. It reminds me, when I was overseas in the Peace Corps, we were making flip books to teach an illiterate audience.
Mm-hmm.
And then what we would do is we would show it to people, we'd kind of beta test the flip charts. And we asked you, say, what do you see here? You know, what do you see here?
Mm-hmm.
And one time we drew a question mark on there. The question mark, they thought it was a snake laying an egg. They had no idea what the question mark meant.
Because if it's not in their written language. Yeah. Or they can't read. Yeah. So they don't know what a question mark is. Oh, that's fascinating. I love that. But it's something that people who can read and use that all the time as a visual signifier wouldn't think of. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. So tell me, so you after so what made you start? How long was it the period between you starting Age of Night and after you finished school?
Actually, no period at all. So I actually came up with the idea for the story with a friend of mine while I was in college. And it was just one of these, like, over summer break, we're just batting around like ideas and stuff because we're not where it's because the creative pressure was off for a couple of months. So we came up with the idea and we're just kind of batting it back and forth, and it didn't really do anything with it for a while, just kind of did sketches and doodles. And then as I was approaching my senior year, I realized, well, I'm going to need a senior project, and I really like this idea that we've been batting around, so I'm going to go through and develop it. So I actually took a conceptual illustration course, which is a misleading title for what that class was. The class was really basically a concept development class, because you basically like just took a concept for a property and you did a bunch of the type of work that you would do as if you were pitching it for something. So we did write-ups on the characters and the setting, and I had to make like maquettes of some of the characters and like a diorama of one of the settings and all of this stuff. So I did all of the development work for it for that class. And then the following quarter, my last one at school, I did the first chapter of Age of Night as my senior project, so that I had the first chapter done, and then I could just take off from there.
So let's say now that you brought up the Age of Night, obviously, give us a background. You talked about a little bit of the history of it.
Mm-hmm.
Look, going over it, it kind of reminds me of, it definitely has a pretty significant kind of a D&D world flavor to it, in the sense
Oh,
of
yeah.
mages and thieves and rogues, but also it has this, I get this impression of, I don't know if you're familiar with the Road movies, the Hope and Crosby Road movies. So Bob Hope and Bing Crosby, there was a series in like the 40s and 50s, where it's these two kind of, gadflies, men about town who kind of get into heists and all this stuff, and kind of have an adventure fall into their lap and not necessarily looking for adventure.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Very much like that.
So give us a background. So when you created it, did you create the characters first, or did you have the world already set up and then you put them into the world?
I had concepts for characters first, and it was developed with my friend Matt Woodall. He hasn't really done much with it since the initial concept phase. He's still credited as creative contribution on the website and in the books, but he didn't actually do any of the script writing or anything like that. And we basically had these characters that we thought were really interesting. And so then it was okay, well, what are they doing? Why does one of them, we were oh, one of them turns into a cat, just because we thought it was funny, because cat people are like that. Because if you have cats, you know. And so they're okay, but why? And then they're well, what are they going to do about it? And so then, also being big mythology nerds, we were oh, well, maybe there's this big mythological connection to why in this world this would be the thing. And it kind of just kept on building from there, of that it's okay, well, we have this mythology connection, and then it's okay, well, then what kind of obstacles would come up if you have this sort of thing happen to you, and just kind of organically grew it from there.
So a few episodes ago, we sat down with a science fiction writer and talking about how he built the world for his, and building a world for fantasy and building a world for science fiction are worlds apart. In the difference where the technology was basically the equivalent of the magic system that you would have in there.
Mm-hmm.
Give us a background on how you built the world, since you had your characters had a character a story set up there. And then after that, how did you build the world from that? What was the foundational pieces you first laid out?
So some of the foundational pieces, so one of the main characters, Drake, he's the avatar of the god of night. And so we were okay, so the god of night is represented by this big cat-like monster, which is why he gets transformed into a cat and has to deal with that. And so then we built out a celestial pantheon from there. So you have a god of night and a goddess of the moon and a god of the sun. And then the earth and the big heavenly dragon that's overall everything. And so it's okay, we've got a theme. We have a theme for the pantheon, is we have the celestial theme, and we know that one of the main characters is going to be the god of night. So you also have to break up okay, if he's the god of night, then what do these other pantheons cover? What is the sun responsible for? What is the moon responsible for? And then it was okay, we knew we wanted a magic user. We wanted a mage. Okay, well, what does she do? What are her powers? And if these are her powers, is that all mages' powers? We decided no. It's just that she works within a particular school of magic where she's of the White Order, so she does healing and purification and that sort of thing. And then developed like a whole magic system that's color coded, but it's really chakra based, if that makes any sense. So that's where all of that comes from, is the basic ideas of the different colors of the orders is actually based on the traditional interpretations of what the different chakras of the body are responsible for. And we don't refer to it exactly in those terms in the comic, but that's kind of the guiding principle for it. But then it's like, okay, so you have mages, but she's like coming from a magical school, so there has to be a school that taught her, and and this is all very rigidly divided. So maybe these mages are really rigid, not just in their philosophy, but also in like their political position and the kind of power that they want to exert in the world. And so, once you started having these kind of pieces, it's like, oh, this story starts building itself of like, oh, there's magic here, but then obviously also the mages have magic that they want to be in control of. But then you also have obviously this main character guy who can turn into a cat. That's magical. So the church has different magic, and maybe there's some friction there between the two of them. So that's where these like pieces start to build off of each other, which was really fun.
And so basically you started off with a religion that then turned into magic, and then it turned into politics.
Mm-hmm.
Then from there, did you at any moment as you were kind of forming this world, did that change your basic meta plot in any direction? Made you decide to say, oh, we need to do this, we need to do that?
Oh my gosh. Yes. So much. So at a certain point too, because the main character, since goes through this reincarnation cycle. So it's like, okay, well now I need to like write a basic history of this world, going back like as far as he would be involved. Like I don't need to flesh out every detail, but I need to have a basic outline of history. And then once you start doing that, it's like, okay, well, now I need to revise this part because now that doesn't make sense. Now I need to go back in and revise that part. And the thing with also working on it for so many years is that as it's developed, as I keep telling more of the story, like get to the point where I'm actually writing the script and drawing the pages and not just having like a vague outline for what's going to happen at some point, is that then as I'm actually writing it, things start occurring to me that like, maybe on my subconscious, I was laying the groundwork for this earlier, but I didn't really realize it. And then I'm like, oh, this is what needs to happen here. This is where this was going the whole time. And so it has like evolved as the years have gone on. It started as a pretty simple personal story with just these handful of characters. But then as we start digging further and further into their stories, more of it keeps coming out and it keeps on like developing and enriching the world further.
So when you did this, so what were some of the as your story has been progressing, what were some of these decisions that you made that were deliberate, and which ones were more organic evolutions in the storyline?
So I mean, one of the things that happened as the story went on is that also like I grew up more as a person. Obviously, I started the story when I was like 19 years old, and I'm significantly older than 19 now. So I'm a little bit more aware of like some of the subtext and stuff that it's coming across on the page. And so like really early on, I had these like really, really early on in the story, I had an appearance by this group of people that had this really like sort of indigenous, like tribal look to them, where it's like, oh, they're all wearing like, furs and kind of like headdresses and stuff. And then later on, I was like, I'm not really comfortable with the fact that this didn't really get explained and didn't really get much representation. And so then when I came back around to them being in the story again, when I was much older and wiser about how that's coming across on the page, I'm like, now I have to actually explain more about these people's culture and develop them more as characters and develop them more as a culture, so they're not these like weird caricatures. Like that's the sort of thing that I was trying to be more cognizant about as I go forward and get older and make more deliberate decisions of like, what am I saying when I do something like this? Like just falling back on weird stereotypes that sometimes crop up in fantasy but are not always very good. Of like, no, you have to make more deliberate decisions about how you represent things, even in a fantasy world, because you're calling on real world tropes. You're calling on real world references that may or may not actually be good things to be incorporating in your work if you're not doing it intentionally and in a good way, if that makes sense.
It's been also, was it a deliberate decision to make when you were kind of crafting the world to not have your classic fantasy races involved in that?
Oh, yeah, that's very deliberate. I have big issues with demi-humans. I have big issues with demi-humans from a biological standpoint because it's dumb. It's dumb that multiple sapient humanoid races would all develop parallel and yet not intermingled. I hate it. It makes no sense.
Somebody's listening to this or watching it with a t-shirt that says dwarves rule. He's like, over with this.
I mean, I like dwarves too. I mean, don't get me wrong, but I wasn't gonna write it because that bothers me. So that was part of it. I don't like the way that they end up getting coded into this weird, like, all the dwarves are Scottish and all of the orcs are weird orientalized caricatures of Tolkien's bad racism from the 1930s. Like, we don't need to do this. We don't need to regurgitate this crap. We need to be more mindful about it. No, I don't. That wasn't the type of fantasy world that I wanted. And that's part of why, like, even though it's clearly a fantasy story, I have to try to, like, temper it by saying, no, it's more of a swords and sorcery thing, because it's certainly not high fantasy. Like, it is more in the vein of something like a Conan story, where it's like, yeah, there's just people, and there's weird arcane elements, but it's basically just people wandering around.
So what, if somebody was able to say that this is an Amanda Kahl trope, what would you say what were some of the things is like, oh, that's totally an Amanda thing? Like, what are some of the stylized either writing references
in drawing? People scowling.
Oh, yeah.
People making this face. So much scowling goes on. I get told that I have kind of a Eurocomic style, which I actually take as a really great compliment, because that's pretty awesome. I mean, it's also sometimes people say I have kind of like an old school D&D illustration style with a lot of like the heavy pen work, because a lot of the like the backgrounds are really rendered and textured, and the figures are done in closer to like a clear line style. So
talk about your style a bit. How, for the artists and cartoonists that are listening right now or watching, what are some, describe your technique. What do you use? Are you all digital? Or you do pen and pencil? Or?
I am a Luddite, and everything I do is very traditional. I have a lovely page that was just posted this week. I'm going to hold up for the camera. I'm sorry, people that are listening to this. You can't see this, but you can check it out at ageofnight.com. This is chapter 23, page 6. But yeah, so I'm still doing it at 10 by 15, standard comic size on 11 by 17 Bristol. I draw it all in Colorase blue, which is like the layout blue. It's a dark blue color, because non-reprographic blue is not real anymore because scanners are too good, and also it hurts my eyes. So I use the darker blue because it's actually really easy to, you don't have to worry about erasing every little bit of it. And then when you scan it in, you can just pull it out of a black and white work in Photoshop. So that works pretty well. And then I go in and I actually letter right on my boards. So I go in and I letter with my little Ames lettering guide and my school nib and put those in. And then I ink everything, usually the backgrounds first, with a pen and nib, like the dip pen.
Wow.
Most of it is the Hunt 102, 107. I forget which number. It's the stiff one. That's what most of the background work is done in. And then I go in and I do my figures in brush. which partially it helps to pull them out a little bit more. It helps to make them pop off the background when it's a more textured background, to leave them a little bit clearer and give them a bolder line, whereas everything in the background usually has a finer line to it. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I do the brush. The brush is a Winsor & Newton Series 7 Kolinsky sable. And I use a kind of a fat one, like a number 4. But they're such good brushes, you can pull a really fine point on them still. So
you letter that yourself as well?
Mm-hmm. Yep, I hand letter the whole thing too.
How do you decide the size of the bubble based off of, do you write it out, then put the bubble around it?
Yes.
Okay.
You write it in pencil first, and then write over it. Like once you kind of like quickly write it in pencil, then you go over and do it in ink, so that you make sure you have your line spacing and your like everything lines up correctly. I forget the word for it. Justification. Yeah. That's all correct. And then I do that in ink. And then once it's on there in ink and you let it dry, then I go through and I do all the circles around them using like circle templates and French curves and stuff.
Wow. So
yeah, it's like ridiculously old school, but I find it very meditative.
So you're the writer, the artist, the inker, the letterer, the finisher.
Yep. And then I scan it in and clean it up and pull the blue out and get it ready to go on the internet. And I save two versions of the file for every page that I scan in. I save a high res version for when it goes to print, and then a lower res version so that it can load quickly on the website.
So more or less like a 30 DPI and then maybe a 300 DPI, or?
Yeah, 72 DPI one, and
okay.
That's a JPEG so that it can load and not take up, because it's a pretty deep backlog, so it takes up a fair amount of space on the website. And then like a really high quality version of it for print as well. Mm-hmm.
So talk to us a bit. So you scan it in. You said you use Photoshop,
mm-hmm.
And so some of our artists and independent publishers out there, what do you use to publish? Which company do you use?
So as of right now, I'm just using KDP, Kindle Direct Publishing. So I'm self-published, so I have to do all the layout and everything on my own. So for actual layout, I'll end up using Adobe InDesign and just getting on the every few years when I have enough pages to make a new book, which takes a few years. I'll just get InDesign for like a month or whatever to put the book together. And then it goes to Kindle Direct Publishing, and they send my files back to me like 7 times telling me they're wrong until they're finally not wrong anymore. And then it gets printed. And then I can order copies to take to conventions, or people can buy them on Amazon, or they can order them from bookstores or whatever else.
So would you consider, and this is one of the other pieces that I've learned, is that the difference between webcomics and digital comics. Would you consider the work you do a webcomic or a digital comic?
So it is still a webcomic, just insofar as I am constantly adhering to an update schedule. So I am updating every Wednesday. A new page goes online. And I find that very useful to have that kind of structure, because that deadline constantly being there means that the pages are getting done. Like a new page has to go online, so I got to draw it, because it's really easy to have a personal project like this just languish and not get worked on. And so having that, it is a webcomic, it must get updated, I must be consistent about that, is really useful. But that said, it is written to be a long form story. Like, it is written to be consumed as a long form story. I try to make sure that every page has something happen on it, but if the longer form of the rest of the chapter just does not work that way, and I have a page where not much happens because it has to be that way because of the flow of the rest of the chapter, then that's what I'm going to do, because the chapter is really the way that it's meant to be read. Right. And a lot of people that I have talked to that do follow it online, they're like, oh yeah, I follow your comic online, but I don't read it every week. I read it every couple of months so that I have a bunch of pages to go back and like get a chunk of it at one time, which is really the best way to read it. So
have you, because you do all the work, everything on it, Do you have a market where you actually sell your originals at all to folks?
No one's no one's ever bought any of my original pages. I don't have them like listed anywhere or anything. I've had a couple of times people have asked me like, well, would you consider selling your originals? I'm like, well, yeah, if you're offering enough. I have put them up in gallery shows a couple of times, and nobody's ever made me offers or anything. But nah. I mean, if the money was good enough, I would sell my originals. Let's be real.
Because those are hours upon hours of
Yeah,
work that's put into that. I
yeah.
mean, it's compared to, some of our peers that do this, they'll sketch something out on their Wacom or whatever, and then
Hmm.
their Cintiq, and they'll draw it right out there and colored it in, and yes, there is art and skill to that as well, but I
But
mean,
there's no artifact.
there's
And
no artifact.
right. And that's part of why I like doing the process like this, even if they're all sitting in a flat file. The fact that they exist as artifacts, I find really gratifying personally.
Right.
I like the fact that they exist and they're there, and I can be like, this giant stack of Bristol is my comic. This is what I've done with the last very many years of my life.
I was talking to somebody. I was talking to the Merrick, who was on last week, and he works in pen that the pens that you can just buy at any office supply store. And he says,
Mm,
I know these pens I know this ink is going to turn light blue or just fade over
mm,
time.
mm-hmm.
And he's like, well, art is fleeting, and and it's like, and it's so fun to talk to you, where it's almost like the point of like archaeological, where
Right.
this is a part of history. It's in a way, it's almost like talking to Frank L. Baum, the writer of the Oz series,
Hmm.
and near the end of his career, where he was writing the 15th or the 20th book, like the Oz is like a whole chunk.
Yeah,
A lot
it's
of
a
it.
whole thing.
He considered himself the chronicler of Oz. So, do you see yourself by doing this now for well over? I honestly don't know how old you are, so I'm just going to say
It
for a
has been
while.
over a decade. I will tell you, it's been over a decade.
At what point do you see yourself not the creator of this, but as the chronicler
Right.
of
Yeah.
someone who's watching this unfold?
Yeah. I mean, I still, if only it came that easily. If I didn't still have to constantly bang my head against the script and the story, then I would maybe feel a little bit more like the chronicler. But I am very painfully writing it a lot of times. So, but there is a certain element to the where it's like it's planned, like the story is planned to last for 5 volumes, and I've completed 3 of them. And so I am at a certain point now where it's like I have to finish it. Like it's not an option anymore. When it was still just one book, and if it had just kind of petered out and I never finished it, it would have been like, oh, that's too bad, but whatever. But at this point, it's like I'm more than halfway there. I'm the majority of the way through it. Like I have to finish it now. So there is that sort of thing where it's like, even if I feel like it is something that I have to do and I'm not just channeling it, I have to do it now. I am beholden to it in a certain way.
Has there been anything else that you've thought about doing do you have any like side promotional things
Mm.
do you have other buttons or something along the lines of things that people can be a part of or purchase that feel as though they're a part of the world you've created?
I've done a little bit of like side merchandise stuff. I've done prints before; those were kind of hit or miss. And I do also I had a line of T-shirts that sold fairly well, just because cat people liked them, because it had Drake on it. It was a panel. It was a panel from the comic where he says, and when I drew the panel in the comic, I was like, oh, that's going to be my first T-shirt. It has to be, because he's like getting mad at someone not respecting him, and he says, I am a god. You're supposed to be worshiping me. He's a little cat saying it, and I was like, the cat people will love this, and the cat people loved it.
So you started, and there's a lot of folks. You started this. You looking at it, you put this out in at least the first few chapters in 2014, but you drew those well in advance before that.
Oh gosh, yeah, yeah.
So how has it been as the, not only, as you say, the writer, the writer, the artist, the 5 or 6 titles, but also the promoter and the marketer? What do you see as the best avenues that you've seen successful in promoting Age of Night?
So the best thing that ever happened for that is when I stopped trying to do that myself and somebody else took that job over. So that's always been like one of my biggest shortcomings in working on this, is that it does take so much time just to create. And then when it comes time to like market, and I'm like, oh, I don't wanna, that part sucks. So about a year ago, a little over a year ago, a game publishing company that I've done freelance illustration work for many years was like, hey, we're expanding our publishing platform. We want to start publishing comics. And the fact that you already have a deep catalog is very appealing to us. And the fact that, we like you, we've worked with you for years. And it's also because it's got that kind of D&D vibe, and they release a lot of D&D, like the open gaming license type material. They were like, it really fits in with like our brand and everything. Would you mind like licensing this to us? I'm like, oh hell no, you go for it. Like you're gonna put it on another platform and sell it for me, and you're gonna market it and handle like putting it on sales and promotions and stuff. You go for it. So that was probably the most successful thing that ever happened as far as marketing for me went, was that somebody else started doing it for me. I will admit my shortcomings, and having to constantly annoy people about my work's existence is one of them.
So do you see yourself, so when you're talking about, you have the idea of having these 5 volumes to it.
Mm-hmm.
When you first outlined that out, how much of the story did waver and move, or are you still pretty much feeling like you're still gonna try to do that in 5 volumes? And have you lost some of this? Have you gone back and looked at some story seeds that you planted that you said, you know what, my fans are going to be so upset if I don't answer this?
Yeah, I do occasionally like go back and reread it and be like, what am I forgetting that I need to loop back around to? And it's a good thing that I do, because sometimes I go, oh yeah, that I need to get back to that. Write that down. But yeah, when I first started, I was like, I want it to be limited. I want there to be an end. So I did conceive of what the end was going to be at the very beginning, so that I always knew what the goal was, because I didn't want to like just wander off into Storyland and never be able to bring myself to a satisfying conclusion. So knowing what the goal was, knowing that there was an endpoint, and knowing what that endpoint was, helps to keep informing my decisions as I move forward through each part of the story. Is that it's like, all right, I know this is where we're going, so we have to keep at least vaguely swimming in that direction. But that has, like, the waypoints along that journey have certainly shifted over time. Because as you're writing too, you'll start to realize, like, oh, what I thought I wanted to do here doesn't really work. Or, oh, the way I wanted this to play out. Oh, as I actually go to write it down, oh, the timeline doesn't actually gel that way. Or, nah, that character hasn't really acted in a way that makes that make sense. So we got to tweak that a little bit. So that has all shifted, but I am still planning on ending it with Volume 5. I'm currently working on Volume 4. So it'll be happening, sometime. Not going to make any promises on how many years that's going to take, but sometime soon-ish.
Yeah.
Soon in like the geological sense.
Well, yeah. I mean, not too long ago in the geological sense, Maine and New Hampshire was a volcanic island, so.
Right, yeah, so it's fine. Plenty of time.
Do you consider yourself, I have an idea, but I want to see what you think. Do you consider yourself a writer who draws, or do you consider yourself an artist who writes?
I don't know. So I'm more comfortable as an artist. I feel like I'm more developed as an artist, partially because the art takes so much longer. So I get a lot more hours sitting at my drafting table than I do at my keyboard. And so I feel more comfortable as an artist, but I have a lot of ideas and I have a lot of things I want to say as a writer. And I have a lot of strong opinions about the craft of writing, like we all do. I'm not going to tell you I'm not great at it, but I have ideas. So yeah, I feel like I'm certainly more developed as an artist, I guess, as my kind of cop-out answer to this question.
And so, do you have any plans for this world after the fact? Is there any ideas of some side stories you say, hey, you know what, this might be a good one-off, one shot that I could do? Or is there any ideas of even creating this as even opening up as an open license to say, hey, if anybody wants to tell a story, I haven't done anything in this part of the world or that?
Mm-hmm. I don't have any story yet for anything outside of this one. This one is still going to take me a while to finish, so I need to stay focused. But I actually do find the idea of opening the world up to other creators really appealing. I don't really want to do that yet, partially because there's a lot about the world that I haven't revealed yet and won't be revealed until later in the story. And so I kind of want to I want to wait until I get there before I let other people start playing in it, because it's like, no, you don't know. There's important things you don't know yet, and I can't tell you. We're not there yet. Just wait. But I actually do find the idea of turning it into an open license type situation really appealing, because I like the idea of shared fiction. I've always found shared universes and shared fiction really fascinating as a concept. I think it's a really cool idea to see what other people can do with stuff. So that might be something that happens in the future. I have had several different game designers also talk to me about the possibility of collaborating and turning it into like an RPG source book. Of something where like, oh yeah, people can play in the world of Age of Night. And none of that has come to actual fruition yet, because people are always like, we should do this project after we do the 800 other projects we're working on. But something that hopefully someday will happen.
So it kind of gets down to my curiosity as well, as you brought up that creating a world like a role-playing game, because I noticed I was looking through this stuff. I didn't find, and a lot of people that do kind of similar stuff that you do, create a wiki, like if you here's the history of this, and this is how this works and this works. Is that part of your deliberate decisions, or that it's on your to-do list, but because you actually physically draw everything out and
right,
and actually make comic art an art form?
I wish I was organized enough to have a wiki. That would be nice if I were an organized enough human being to have a wiki, which is funny because I am fairly organized. It's just that my capacity for organization is very limited. So I'm like, I keep hold on, I've got this right behind me. It's the convenient thing about being right next to my drafting table. So I'm like, okay, here's my little binder where I have all of my scripts, and all of my scripts are like labeled by like which chapter they are, and then like I've got the script and all of the thumbnails, and it's all super hyper organized so I can't lose them. And then all of my like digital files are super hyper organized so I can't lose any of my pages anywhere in digital land. And then I'm like, oh yeah, where's that note about what's supposed to happen in the next part of the story? One of these notebooks somewhere in here. Is it this one? No. Is this one over here? Nope, not that one either. Gee, I wonder where I wrote that down. So it's like I can only be so organized, and then my brain just gives up. Says, no, we're done here.
So have you been pretty consistent in having that weekly schedule coming out?
Yeah. So obviously, like anybody, like life has come up in the past. The only major breaks I've ever taken where I took 2 large breaks, one for each time I had a child. Those will mess up your schedule. So yeah, I took maternity leave, so to speak, twice, and I took one shorter break for bereavement after my mother passed. But other than that, I've been mostly really consistent, and I would have the occasional like, I just couldn't get a page out this week. But then last year, when I was finishing volume 3, I decided for finishing volume 3, it came out in March, exactly a year ago, pretty much. I decided like, no, I want to get ahead. Like rather than having it release after I finish all the pages and post them online, I actually want the book to come out a full chapter and a half or so ahead of what's available online, so that it'll incentivize people to want to read and purchase and read volume 3, because they'll have content that's not available for free yet. So with that, I had to get a good, it was something like a 4-month buffer in order to finish the book ahead of where it was posting online. So I spent that winter just cranking out pages and got this really big buffer. And that buffer has waxed and waned a few times in the intervening year. But I've managed to at least stay far enough ahead that I have not missed any updates since then. And I'm still in good shape to not miss updates anymore now that I'm maintaining that buffer. And it's one of those things that it's sometimes I would have a little bit of one and sometimes I wouldn't. And there were plenty of times where I would just be finishing the page that night to upload. And thankfully I'm not doing that anymore, because that was very stressful.
Yeah, that was my leading question to ask you. How much of a buffer do you have? Because that's always the classic person who does webcomics that makes
right. How big is your buffer? Next question, please. Yeah. Right. I was when I was in college, I saw it was Scott Kurtz and Dave Kellett came and did a talk at SCAD when I think actually I'd just graduated, but I still could get into events because I had an alumni day or whatever. And someone in the audience asked, hey, how much of a buffer do you have? That's a great question. Next question. They're like, you guys are professionals. What are you doing? No. But no, now I usually maintain a buffer of around a month. And sometimes it'll be a little bit more, and sometimes it'll be more 2 weeks, and I start getting nervous, depending on how hectic the rest of my life is getting. But it usually sits at around a month right now.
Okay.
Yep.
And so who are some of your long form storytelling webcomic inspiration that you would recommend to people who are listening or watching?
So not a ton of people do long form, but a handful of people in the ye old comics days, ye old webcomics pioneers days, did the long form one. Way back in the day when it was a thing, I used to read Errant Story. I don't even know if you can find that online anymore. I don't know if it's still hosted. Oh my gosh, Mookie actually revived Dominic Deegan in the past year. That came back. Dominic Deegan was one that, although it was told in a strip format, it was actually a long form story. And now it's back. It's happening again, which is I hit my keyboard and it muted me. Also, another current one that I really love her art style, and it's just super cute and it's really fun to look at, is The Sea and You by Jessie Sharon, I think is her name. It's mermaids, mermaids and romance, and it's adorable. If you like other fantasy type stuff. I don't do mermaids, I'm sorry, but I know a lot of people really love mermaids. So.
Yeah, people say mermaids are the new unicorns. This
is a thing. It's a thing.
Yeah, actually, sloths for some reason.
Sloths
are coming in big. I don't know what's going on.
Yeah, I don't know. And llamas. Llamas are the meanest, nastiest creatures in existence. But then there's all these cute little cartoon llamas on everything, and it's no, they're wicked, awful beasts.
They'll spit on you.
They will spit on you, and they won't feel sorry about it.
So tell us about a little bit about your Patreon page. You actually have a fairly active, looks like a Patreon site.
Yes. Yeah. So my Patreon, the big perk on it, the big standard perk on it, available as soon as you get in on it, is that the comic pages on Patreon are always a week ahead of where they're being released to the public. So you always get to see those a little bit early. Even at just $1 a month, you get early comics. I also like to post a lot of like process work. I'll post, like, if I do instructional videos, I'll post them there first. Um, and also right now, I'm trying to do a series of other small projects in addition to working on Age of Night this year. So I have my quarterly comic projects going on this year. The first quarter, what I'm working on is a pitch for a superhero comic with a friend of mine. And so I've been doing updates on how the pitch is going, like showing some of our concept work and some of our pages that are in development. So this is like it's like a short run comic series. I think my friend Jeremy Flagg, who's doing the writing on this one, and I'm just doing the art this time. He's, I think, scripted out 4 chapters for it. So it's just a short run comic, but it's a really intense story, and involves superpowers because that's really his thing. But it's also, it involves superpowers, but it's told in more of like the street level hero style, where it's not like capes and spandex. It's like more like the, what's the name of the Netflix one, that the Marvel one that Netflix was doing and then abandoned because they botched it.
Oh, was it not the not
um,
Daredevil or?
yeah, it was the one with Daredevil and Luke Cage and Jessica Jones and all that. It's that
the
sort
Defenders?
of the Defenders. Yes, yeah.
Yes.
It's
Okay.
more like that. It's more
Okay.
like that, where it's like, no, it's just like regular people and like
Yeah.
regular setting. So, but so that's been really fun updating people on that too. So people get to see like not just the comic work itself, but see what goes into making a comic pitch. Like, what is the kind of stuff you have to come up with, and how does that get all pulled together? And then higher level patrons also, I do updates of my pencils as they're in progress, which is kind of a fun behind the scenes thing. So every like couple of weeks, I'll upload another batch of pencils of the upcoming pages. So it's just the drawing without any of the ink and without any of the lettering. So sometimes they don't make a lot of sense so that it doesn't spoil the story that's coming up, but you can still like see the artwork in progress, which is pretty neat.
And so the colors that you use, and that's all is it watercolor? Is it crayon? Is it pencil? It looks as though it might be a mixed media, or
that depends on what you're looking at, because I work in all sorts of different media.
okay. Like when you actually design like the cover, when you do the colors for
the covers for Age of Night, because usually Age of Night is just black and white.
Right.
All the comic pages are black and white. But when I do the covers, those are actually just colored pencil. Yeah, they take me a really long time. I go really slowly and deliberately on those because I really want them to have a really nice polished look to them, but those are just colored pencil. A lot of my illustration, when I do like freelance illustration work, I'll do like a mixed media kind of approach where I'll do like watercolor and water soluble ink pencils and colored pencil and like some gouache here and there. But for those covers, I did just colored pencil.
Wow. So tell us a little bit about, I mean, we're about knocking on an hour right now, so that was pretty quick. So tell us where our listeners and viewers can find your stuff. They find it at ageofnight.com.
At ageofnight.com, so that's AGEOFNIGHT. There's no K in it. It's the time of day, not the guy in the suit of armor. The Patreon is patreon.com/ageofnight. You can also find me on Twitter at Age of Night and on Instagram at Amanda Kahl Art. So that's just my name with ART after it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Amanda. I'm always consistently fascinated to hear about people's creative processes, and it'll give people a bit more of inspiration on how they can pick themselves up and just got to do it. So what would be your advice to potential writers and artists out there who are thinking about picking up a pen or start typing? What would be some of the advice you'd give them?
Is that you have to pick something and finish it. You have to pick because that's the thing, is that it's really easy to just keep on tinkering with something forever and try to get it perfect, but you need to just finish something. That was the big thing of why I started putting Age of Night online, is because then I had to be accountable. I had to finish it. I had to keep stuff updating. And that's the biggest thing you have to do, is you have to pick something and just leap, and just leap off of it and get it to a point where it's finished, and you have to show somebody else and say, yep, it's done. Just get to that end point. It can be just the end of the first chapter. It can be just the end of one piece, like one comic issue, one comic strip, anything. You have to get one thing done, because once that one thing is done, it is so much easier to get to the next thing and finish that too and keep going.
Wow, thank you very much.
This is episode ampersand 29 hashtag